In this video, I'm going to tell you how to do a payroll walkthrough. Payroll tends to be one of the most important areas in an audit, so understanding the related internal controls is absolutely critical. Quick overview of how payroll works. Obviously, people are hired, and then once they're hired, there's a payroll file, and in that payroll file, there's an authorization for the payroll rates. Those rates are keyed into the payroll software, and usually the bank account number for the employee is also keyed into the software so that they can be paid electronically. Payroll normally occurs once every 2 weeks. You'll see different periods for different organizations, but usually it's every week or every 2 weeks. Most of the time, I see it occurring every 2 weeks. So once the employee is hired, they obviously start working, and as they work, usually the time for that person is inputted into the software in some manner. Some organizations have electronic time clocks, some have manual systems, so you'll want to know which type of system they have and how the hours are recorded and maintained. For many employees, they're salaried, so the time records are maybe less important than they would be for hourly employees. But nevertheless, the system will normally record the amount of time that each employee is working. Again, for the hourly employees, well, you've got to know how much time they worked in order to pay them. Once a payroll period ends, usually there are supervisors that review the time that's in the payroll software. Those supervisors approve or disapprove of the hours in the system, and then based on that final approval of the time, payroll gets teed up for processing. For employees that are not hourly, they're salaried, then their paychecks usually are pretty much the same from period to period. Once the supervisors in departments approve of the payroll, then it's time normally for the payroll supervisor to review all of the information that has been teed up for the payroll process. Now, once that review occurs, then the payroll supervisor will normally approve the overall payroll, and at that point, it's ready to be disbursed. Then payroll is processed and everyone receives a paycheck, and they're very happy about that, I can assure you. Now, sometimes they're not happy, and that happens when payroll is not processed the right way and they feel like they've been shorted on their pay. Believe me, if you're in a payroll department, you'll hear about this. So one of the things that you want to know as an auditor is when payroll is not processed in the right manner, how does that get corrected? So this will tell you a lot about the payroll internal controls when you look at how payroll mistakes are corrected. Most payrolls today are paid electronically, so there's an electronic deposit into each employee's bank account. So one of the things that happens when employees are hired, that employee provides the bank account number that's placed into the payroll software, and that's how the company knows where to send those electronic deposits. So understanding how the bank account number process works, who keys those bank account numbers in, and also who has the ability to change those bank account numbers is very important. If you're thinking about the potential for fraud in payroll, you're thinking right, because this is one of the areas where a lot of money can be stolen in a short period of time. And one of the primary ways that theft occurs in payroll is through ghost employees. So, what is a ghost employee? Well, it's not some ethereal being. It's somebody usually that formerly worked for the organization. They've been terminated, and then what often happens is the payroll supervisor or somebody with rights to the payroll software, they switch that former employee's bank account number to their own bank account number, and they leave that person in the system. Now, when this happens, say the payroll supervisor, if he or she does this, then that person's receiving multiple payroll checks. I saw this happen about 5 years ago, and a company lost almost $1 million where the payroll supervisor was receiving as many as 8 payroll payments for every payroll. That's a sweet way to make money, but it turned out really bad for her. She went to jail. But you need to understand the internal controls as they relate to the input of the bank account number, and also how an employee is terminated and removed from the payroll system. Why? Again, because ghost employees are quite often former employees that are left in the system. So it's very important that when a person's terminated, that they are removed from the payroll system. There should be a control that ensures that that former person is in fact removed. Let's take a look at some of the questions that you might ask as you perform the payroll walkthrough, and you're going to see this in the article, but I've listed several questions here, such as, does the company have a separate payroll bank account? How often is payroll processed? What time period does the payroll cover? Who has the authority to hire and fire employees? What paperwork is required for a new employee? Is payroll budgeted? And this question is really important because the budget to actual reports can quite often tell you whether or not overpayments are occurring, and sometimes the overpayments are fraudulent. So it's important that we have a budget and we're comparing the budgeted payroll expenses back to what's actually occurring. Also, who monitors the budget and actual reports? Is it somebody in payroll and the payroll department, or does the CFO from time to time or the controller from time to time take a look at these budget to actual reports? Who controls payroll check stock? So if payments are being made with physical checks, you want to know who controls the paper check stock and where it's stored. Another question you'd want to ask is, does the company use direct deposit? If so, who keys in those bank account numbers? Who approves overtime? Another critical piece to payroll. Normally that's a department head that's familiar with the amount of time that each employee is working within their department. Another question, who monitors compliance with payroll laws and regulations? So somebody should be making those payroll deposits in a timely manner. Somebody should be filing the 941s. You want to make sure there's somebody in the entity that has sufficient knowledge to get these regulatory issues dealt with in an appropriate manner. So who processes payroll? In other words, who approves the final payroll before it's paid? Another really important question is, who signs the checks? More and more I'm seeing checks signed electronically. If they're physically signed, you want to know who's actually signing those checks. If they're electronically signed, you want to know that. Another question is, how are the payroll tax payments made and how often and who makes them? Also, who creates the year-end payroll tax documents such as the W-2s? So if somebody in the payroll department is committing fraud and they also control the W-2 creation, they can cover up their fraud by changing the W-2s. So you want to look and see who's creating the W-2s. Also, what controls ensure the recording of payroll in the appropriate period. So you want to make sure that payroll is cut off at the right time. In every transaction cycle, you want to make sure that the appropriate segregation of duties exists. So as you're looking at payroll, consider who approves each payroll, who processes the payroll, who reconciles the related bank statements, who has possession of signed payroll checks if there are any physical checks, who has the ability to enter or change the employee bank account numbers, who has the ability to add or take away a person from the payroll software. Another question is, who approves the salary rates and how? So could just anybody get a raise? I don't think so. So we want to know who approves those increases in the salary rates, whether they're annual salaries or they're hourly salaries. Another question is, who approves the bonuses? Probably the same people, but we want to know who those are. What benefits exist within the business, such as pension plans, and who controls that process. And then finally, one of the more important issues in payroll is whether or not a service organization is being used for payroll processing. Companies like ADP or Paychex, if you have a service organization in play, then that's simply an extension of the client's payroll system. So we need to get that service organization control report, what we commonly call a SOC report, and review it. At this point, if you're still with me, you may be thinking, man, that is a lot of things to think about, and it really is. So let's step back for a moment and consider, what are the key controls, what are the most important controls. The first control I want you to think about is who has the authority to hire and bring that new person into the organization. The second thing I want you to think about is who enters the payroll rates into the payroll software. Hopefully that's somebody separate from the person that authorized the hiring of that person. Next, I want you to think about how time is captured and who approves any time that goes into the software, especially in relation to overtime. Another critical piece is who reviews all of the payroll information before it's processed. Quite often this is a payroll supervisor. Sometimes department heads will do an initial review, but usually the payroll supervisor has the final authority to review all of the information before they pull the trigger on payment. We also said that another important piece is who removes terminated employees from the payroll software, because we don't want any ghost employees. One other very important piece, I go back to those bank account numbers, who inputs the bank account numbers and who can change those bank account numbers. Another control that I hope you see in your system is a budget to actual report, and somebody reviewing that information outside of the payroll department. In other words, you really don't want just the payroll supervisor reviewing the budget to actual reports. You want department heads and maybe a controller or a CFO reviewing those budget to actual reports. I'll talk about one more area before we wrap this up, and that is how are errors corrected. There's going to be some payroll errors, but how are those corrected? Now, the last thing I'll say to you as you look at these important internal controls, look and see whether or not there's appropriate segregation of duties. I hope you found this video helpful, and as you do your future walkthroughs, that you'll be very successful.